So there's so many things that we need to consider. For example, if you're working with a startup that is trying to expand, right? So let's say francophone countries, you need to consider certain providers, right? Because the kind of documents that they use in those countries is a little bit different from what we use there. So you need to find a provider that has that capacity. So there's so many things that we need to consider. So that's why we have AbdulRasaq here today. So AbdulRasaq has worked several years, everything that needs to do with compliance, transaction monitoring, right? So he has a lot of experience, several years of experience working in this space, and he's currently a senior manager compliance at MoneyPoint. So you know for a fact that he's an expert and he can walk the talk in this space. So let's welcome AbdulRasaq. AbdulRasaq, thank you for joining us. Are you ready to talk to us?
Yeah, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Nice to be part of this community.
All right, happy to have you. Over to you.
Okay. Permit me to share my screen.
Yes, please.
Can you see my screen?
It's coming up. Okay, yeah, we can see it now.
Okay. All right, thanks. So again, welcome. I'm AbdulRasaq. I'm on LinkedIn. Right. I think I started my career as a young bank, so I didn't come to that as part of the success of it. Because that's a traditional bank. And yes, over the course of my career, I've been able to work with several KYC providers. And there's a lot that is happening in the industry. So throughout this session, we'll be breaking down this topic into 6 key areas. We'll look at why the African market is complex when we talk about KYC. Then we'll look at some examples of vendors in this markets. So local guys as well as some of the global guys. And then we'll go into the trade-offs. There are more than 6, but we'll be focusing on 6 trade-offs that you can use to make a decision. Beyond that, we'll be looking at data regulates, right? You can have the best provider in the world, right? But if you don't have data, right, you really cannot get everything tangible. So it is key that even internally, you have the right data for the KYC process. So we'll be talking about that. And then we'll look at a use case from scenario where a company has adopted a provider and then had to change because of the measures. And then we'll take questions at the end of the session. So at the end of this session, I believe that we should be able to walk away from this collaboration, this discussion, with 3 key things. One is knowledge, meaning the understanding of the KYC mechanics. How does it affect your product at the end of the day? How does it affect the overall strategy of the company? And then beyond the knowledge, right, by the time you understand that, this is very important for the company as well, then what framework do we need to put in place to ensure that we make the right decisions? Now, when you have the framework, then the next thing is to be able to use that framework to make the right decision and then take action. So I believe that some of us here are already working with Fintech at a different stage in the Fintech world. Some are just starting up as in the MVP stage, some are growing, some are scaling to other African countries. At each of these stages, there are preferred solutions in terms of KYC providers that better serve the company moving into the next stage. So we'll be discussing those as well. So in Africa, as we all know, we have about 54 countries, right? And this is not, well, maybe this is by design because Africa was colonized, right? And the 7 European countries that colonized Africa divided us into 4 countries. Now, beyond the 54 countries that we then have about 30 plus regulatory bodies, right? In Nigeria, for example, we have CBN, right? In all of these 4 countries, they have regulatory bodies that's in charge of KYC, right? Now, why you have 30, which is less than the African nations, is simply because in some regions in Africa, the regulatory bodies cover multiple countries. So you have regions like the YMA, which is the Francophone speaking West African countries that includes Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, and these countries. And then you have the CEMAC region, which is Central African region. So in those regions, they have multiple countries covered by single regulatory body, right? So because of these multi-regulatory bodies and multiple, approach to regulations, to the compliance regulations, each of these countries have different means of KYC, right? The requirements are quite different. In fact, the identity documentation is quite different. Even if you look at Nigeria as a whole, Nigeria today, right, has one single regulator, right? But in identifying an individual, you have multiple documentation to identify somebody. So what that simply means is that whatever KYC provider that you go for, they should be able to verify each and every identity document that is available in the Nigerian market today, which is also in the level of complexity. By the time you compare that with other countries like in the European nations or the US, they typically have single verification documents, which is easier, right? So the African market is very complex, and that is why we have over 400 million bankable adults that are underbanked or they are unbanked. And this is almost half of the entire adult population in Africa. So because of this complexity, that is why we are here today. Now, here you have some of the players in the industry. We have the local providers and then we have the global providers. Of course, we have more than this. There are probably hundreds or even thousands of providers. And providers keep coming on almost every day, especially with the advent of Fintech, Connected, and how prospect that a lot of African companies are coming really these days. So a lot of people are going into regulatory technology providing services. I'm sure some of you are familiar with some of these names. For the local providers, they are with you in your country. For example, taking Nigeria as an example, these guys are here with you, right? So they know the regulations, they know what is required, right? And they're able to serve you. They're also in some other African countries, some of them try to expand this. But of course, they have strengths, their strength areas and partly 1, 2, 3 countries in Africa, right? And then for the global guys, these are European companies, US, UK companies that have built their solutions looking at the best practice, right? And they believe they can expand this all over the world, right? And because of the buzz that Fintech in Africa, a lot of them are beginning to come into Africa, right? In fact, some of them are even beginning to have representatives in Africa, just to be able to understand the African user. Because at the end of the day, when you're having conversations with these guys, the global providers, for example, you spend a lot of time explaining your regulatory requirement to them, the specifics, right? But they are trying to bridge that gap as well to absolve the country to be able to do that for them. Likewise, the local providers are also trying to expand, because African fintechs are also expanding globally. Right? So the local providers are also trying to expand. So as we progress in this industry, the gap between the local providers and the global providers is getting thinner. So some of the things I've been saying in this session today might be changing, might be maybe the reality as of last year or a few months ago, right? Because the gap between these guys are getting closer and closer. So we're focusing on 6 key trade-offs today: cost, compliance, speed, data sovereignty, integration, scalability. Like I said, there are a lot of things to consider when you are making your choice of providers. But here today, we're focusing on these 6 key areas. First is cost, right? Now, cost is simple, and cost is what probably most founders and leadership teams usually shine their eyes upon, right? When you're looking at cost of a provider, right, it goes beyond the surface cost of the tool that you're purchasing, right? Every tool will have a cost. They'll tell you, okay, if your users is between maybe 100 and 100,000, this is the cost. Up to 1 million, this is the cost per annum, implementation, and all of those things, right? But it goes beyond that, because as a company, your focus is how many users will be onboarded at the end of the day, right? Not just how many people try to onboard, how many users get across to the other side, right? So you should focus on the cost per successful users or the cost per onboarded users in terms of KYC, right? So one of the questions you should be asking these providers is, guys, of course, you are not yet connected to me, but from your experience, your connection with other similar companies like my company, right? And this is very key, right? You need to be able to understand whether the provider has onboarded someone like you, a company in your industry, a company in your jurisdiction. It's very key. So you ask them, based on some of the guys that you've onboarded, what is the conversion rate? You need to understand, because if the conversion rate is, let's say, 50%, it means that the cost per onboarded user will be whatever the cost is divided by 2, right? But if the conversion rate is higher, is 80%, so you divide it by 8, it means that the cost will be lower per user, right, if the conversion rate is higher. So this is very key and it's very important. But generally, the local providers are quite cheaper compared to the global providers. And this is largely because they charge in local currency, right? They are more open to negotiations, because a lot of them are still trying to improve their portfolio, right? And depending on the level in which your company is, if your company is a fintech, for example, a lot of these guys would like to have you associated with their company, so they would be able to go lower in terms of cost. So they're generally cheaper. But for the global guys, they tend to have more robust solutions that have a lot of specs, right? And their costs are more standard. Right? Even when they are negotiating, they probably, before they reduce anything, they probably have to go and speak with the most senior person at their group level, right? One other thing about cost is that over the cost of the experience with some of these guys, you tend to see the global providers tend to be more honest in terms of, or more transparent in terms of the total cost, right, compared to the local providers, right? You don't want to be in a situation where you've already discussed costs and you've signed on, but after going live, right, you're asking for maybe some features that you see on the platform, and then the guys are telling you, oh, this costs additional, this would cost you more, this will cost you more, this will cost you more. Some things that you expect generally is part of the package. So you want to avoid that kind of back and forth in terms of costs, the overall cost, and all of those things. So that's why it's very good that you ask the right questions at the beginning, and then you document your communications with this guy. It's very key. You document everything that you discuss. Because at the end of the day, after you sign, you've already signed, maybe you signed 2 years. If you go into issues, you probably have to bear the cost for those 2 years and bear the inefficiency of the solution as well. So moving on, the regulatory cover. Now, the local providers are here with you So they understand the regulations. They understand what, if there is a new circular, they read it with you, they understand it. So in most cases, we don't even spend so much time explaining the requirement because they know this requirement. And their solutions are tailored to this requirement. So it's easier, right? But comparing that to the global providers, their solutions are more generic. So they pick global best practice standards, say the UK, for example, or the US, for example. And because those guys, those countries, their regulations are sent to the standards, right, in terms of FATF requirements, right? So they believe that by the time their solutions meet those requirements, it should meet some of the other requirements. But the case, that is not the case, especially when we put to the calculations. Yes, the overall objective for compliance is the same, but the means in which in meeting those objectives are different. You see, then we ask you to verify BVA. In the UK, nobody verifies BVA, right? So if a provider is coming from the UK, they will struggle with BVA verification, for example, if they have not done it before, right? So in that light, local providers tend to be able to give you the best compliance level and better data guys. But if you're looking at the, for example, information systems, information management systems, right, and all of other risk management applications, the global guys tend to tick those boxes, right, because they have a more resilient solution, they meet global best practice and all of those things, right, and they have good dashboard, they have multiple features that use. The local guys tend to focus on specific regulatory requirements with respect to KYC. Now, in terms of verification speed and user experience, similar to what I just said, the local providers, they are directly connected to the various databases. For example, the BVA bit. They have connections in various government agencies that are in charge of some of these databases. So they easily connect, and it is quite fast because they have direct connection. But for the global providers, yes, I mean, in recent times, a lot of them have tried to, bridge this gap and have local people. But a whole lot of them still rely on other local providers to give them these services. So what that means is, while the local provider is going directly to names, the global provider is going through someone. And because of that, that route, that might have some effects on the speed, right, as well as the cost. Because if I'm going through someone, I have to pay that person, and then I need to also add my own margin to it, right? And also, there's also an issue of, network or bandwidth, network bandwidth, right? The local providers are here in Nigeria, so they probably did their testing of their solutions using 2G or 3G network that all of us use, right? So the systems are more reliable in terms of, you have a low network or your phone is not sophisticated smartphones, right? Compared to the global providers where what the prevalent over there is maybe 5G or high bandwidth. So when they are testing their solutions, it will be difficult for them to use African case scenarios to test their solution because the network there is very fast. So that's what they test it with, right? So by the time you now bring that solution to Africa, they might face some challenges, right? And I know that I've experienced this in one of my experiences past where I think then I was using, I think Samsung Note 9, and they were testing this solution. I had to honor the light in my house, and still my selfie was not capturing. I was like, if Samsung Note 9 cannot do this, then I mean, how many Africans will be denied of this? And because of that experience, we had to do away with that particular provider. Right? So these are very important. And by the time we are testing this solution, these are the things that you look out for. Because you are onboarding this partner not because you just want to tick the box. Right? You are onboarding the partner because you want the partner to support your company's journey in acquisition. You wouldn't go spend a lot of money in marketing, and by the time the customers are trying to onboard, half of them are doing shortcuts of the system. Right? So it is very, very important that these due diligence, these testings are well and so next is data sovereignty and residency. So if you follow the trend across the world and of course in Africa, in the last maybe two years so now, there have been multiple regulatory regulations with respect to data protection requirements, right? Even in Nigeria, everywhere, right? So different governments are trying to minimize how much data the country share with the rest of the world, right? And because of that, is this data residency. Every government wants data to remain. My citizens' data should remain in my country. Right? If you need to export data, then you need to maybe take permission or put some processes in place. Now, for local providers, this is easy for them because they are here. They tell you the data is here, so it's not going anywhere. Easy, right? But for the global guys, of course, we need to do more to ensure that the residency requirements does not invalidate the regulatory requirements. There are some things to put in place, and they all know that, right? Because they've also done their own due diligence, right? Whether it is data processing, or maybe need to take some permissions, they can help you to do that. But it is easier to deal with the local guys to ensure compliance with data requirements compared to the providers. So next up is technical integration. So the local providers, their solutions are quite simple compared to the global providers solution. It's quite simpler because they try to focus on specific, a specific country and then specific requirements. Right? KYC, identity verification. Right? Very simple. Right? They have smaller teams, right? And they have direct connections. So it is easier to integrate with them. Right? Compared to the global providers, they have a lot of documentations. Of course, everything has its advantages, right? They have documentations, they have full stack solutions. You can then begin to pick the ones that they want for their solutions. And then they have larger engineering teams. And then they have a very good testing environment, sandbox environment, and live environment. And this is very, very important, which is an area that I think the local providers are also trying to improve upon. It is important that you have a testing environment which is really separate from the lab environment. Because if you use your lab environment for testing, it becomes an issue in the long run, even for regulatory purposes. Imagine a regulator coming to your company, right, and says, give us the list of your customers. And by the time you pull the list of your customers, you start seeing tests 101, test 001, test 002 as customer needs, right? Because you have tested, on your live environment. So it becomes a challenge, trying to explain to the regulator, oh, it was tests, right? So it's very important. And your ability to have a test environment will let you know what you would gain, where to predict how the live environment is. In most cases, whatever doesn't work in your test environment would not work in your live environment. So don't let anybody tell you that, oh, don't worry, it's because this test environment will work when we go live. Don't let anybody say. Don't accept that. If it doesn't work in test, it's most likely not work when you go live. And if it works during tests, there's a possibility that it will not work when you go live. So if your test result is, say, 80%, right? You do not expect your live result to be 90%. You should expect it to be lower than that. Yeah, so that is why it is important to carry out your tests very well. Because the worst case scenario is where you've gone live and then you spend the first year after implementation trying to clean up issues that you ought to have dealt with during the testing phase. Okay. The scale, reliability, and multi-country expansion. Of course, the local providers, right, will struggle more in expanding. Why? Because their solutions are mostly tailored to a particular country, right, and regulatory requirements, right. So if someone has built a solution tailored to Nigeria, for example, and you say, okay, my company now wants to expand to South Africa, for example. Of course, they will tell you they are working on something or they can build it, but they have to go and build, something so they can add on to it. It's more like starting something just like a layer, first floor, second floor, right? And that's probably take more time. But for the global providers, their solutions, the foundation of their solutions is global, right? In most cases, right? So it's just one or two specific requirements that they needed to add to be able to serve some other countries, especially if you're expanding across European countries, America, or the UK. It's easier for them. While for the local providers, they can easily support you with the expansion across African nations. So those are the 6 key trade-offs that you must consider when you make the decision whether to go for a local provider. And by the time you choose the preferred provider, you still then need to review the multiple options that you have. Because like we saw earlier, you have multiple vendors that are global, and then you have multiple vendors that are local as well. So you need to ask the right questions to identify the best solution for your specific company, right? Putting the context of your company in the picture of it. Now, data readiness. Without data, no provider will solve the problem. No provider will make you compliant. If you don't have data, right, you need to fix the data issues. Now, you can have data, but it is not structured. It is not clean. You need to sit with your leadership team, sit with your engineering guys, the product guys, and say, hey guys, we need to solve this. If not, you are only going to export your problems into the solution. And it's garbage in, garbage out, right? So it is very key that you get your data right. And of course, data mapping is part of the requirements when you're implementing some of these solutions, right? You want to ensure that where you have your surname, it is fitting into where the solution has surname or last name. You don't want a situation where date of birth is fitting into surname, and then gender is fitting into date of birth, right? That will not give you the result that you're looking for, right? And if you look at the the requirements now, especially in Nigeria, where the CBN recently released in the baseline requirement for AML CFP solutions, right? CBN is not only going to, unlike before that, they'll just ask you when they come for that, okay, what solution are you using? Say this, okay, download the list of your requirement for us. Where is your risk appetite, risk rating documentation? It goes beyond that. The CBN is now focused on risk-based, the effectiveness of these solutions. How connected are they, right? You can have a KYC solution, you can have a separate transaction monitoring solution, you can have a separate reporting solution, but each of them must connect and data must flow seamlessly across in such a way that there is a two-way traffic, right? So it is very important that you deal with your data issues before you sign up to any particular solution. Because if you don't do that, you might end up spending the first year after implementation, or even 2 years after implementation, cleaning up the issues. And by the time you're doing that, you've already paid the provider. And then you also need resources to do those cleanups. So it is not, I've been in that scenario in the past is not a very good place to be. So this just shows the framework of a very good approach to making a decision in terms of provider. If you are just starting, that's the MVP stage, right? It is easier to go for a local provider, right? Because of course MVP stage is just want to get the product out there, right? Meeting all the basic requirements. And of course, because you are just starting up, probably you still struggling in terms of financing. So the cost matters, the speed matters, the country requirement also matters. And the best that goes with this for now is local providers. Of course, like I said, some of the global providers are also bridging this gap. So some global providers can also give you some of these things, right? But I mean, if you look at it holistically, right, local providers tend to move faster, much cheaper, understand the local requirements, right? If your company is at the growth stage, meaning that you already have quite a number of customers, but you need to improve the user experience in terms of onboarding, improve conversion rate and all of those things. Then you might want to layer, you might want to use both. You might keep the local provider to focus on those specific areas that they are exceptional at, while you then bring in the global provider, to make life easier, to make the experience easier, because they have a better solution respect to that. And by the time you are ready to scale globally, you want to go to UK, you want to go to Africa, US, and all of those things, then you might tend more towards the global providers, right? Because one important factor in this choice as well, which is not part of our 6 key trade-offs, is that when you want to expand, right, especially outside Africa, in most cases you need to partner with other financial institutions over there, right? And these financial institutions do their due diligence on the company, right? So during the due diligence process, they will typically ask you what provider are you using, right? And by the time you mention a global provider's name that they are familiar with, that makes the due diligence process easier. So, okay, these guys probably they know what they are doing. Probably the compliance program, is very big. Right? So that's one advantage that the global providers also give you when you're expanding. So this is a use case, right? When you have a multi-currency fintech, I think this is a common fintech these days, right? And because it is a multi-currency fintech, meaning that they provide Naira, USD, Euro to their customers, they needed to partner with foreign financial institutions. And because of that, perhaps that's one of the reasons why they chose a global provider to start with. Right. But by the time they started with the global provider, right, the drop-offs were so large. The global provider could not, the connections with the NIN, these verifications, and were not top notch, right? So a lot of customers were dropping down. They couldn't get to the end of the onboarding process, right? And that was affecting the company as a whole, how they wanted to build the numbers, right? So they did not review that process and decided to bring in a local provider just for those specific challenges. And local provider was able to make life easier for those specific challenges, while the global provider that focused more on the other areas where they are very good. And this led to times for success results. So what this means is, if out of 10 customers that are trying to onboard, only 2 are going through when they were with the global provider. But by the time they adopted this hybrid solution, 8 were going through, 8 over 10, right? That then reduces the cost per onboarded user at the end of the day. because those eight that were onboarded will eventually do transactions and, of course, good revenue. But when you were in two, the eight that were not onboarded is a waste of resources. So here is just a snapshot of the comparison, the strengths of the local, the global, and the hybrid stack, looking at the various dimensions. And of course, we are getting to the end of the session. Things to take away is, if you are starting as a fintech, start simple, right? Start with the local provider to get your MVP out there. And then as you grow, right? Of course, the local provider is also growing. I believe they are also expanding their product, expanding those. Right? But depending on who is faster in the field, they can grow with you, but you get to a stage where you might then need to upgrade the provider to the global options. And then second thing you take away is compliance is a design decision. Compliance is far beyond regulatory requirements ticking the box. It affects the overall strength of the company. Because the first point of contact of every customer is onboarding. Every customer needs to onboard, whether you like it or not. That is the first impression that you're going to do. So your choice of KYC provider determines how fast the customer can be onboarded. The experience that you're exposed to them, and then the outputs that you then use to engage with the regulators. The success, like we saw in the example, the use case that we saw, 4 times is definitely better than 2 times, isn't it? And that eventually affects the growth of the company. The third that you should take away is the data readiness. Please, your data should be usable. It should be clean. If you have data issues, it is time to start solving those problems. Because if you don't, regardless of the solution that you implement, you will always have inefficiencies, right? And it is better to start picking up earlier than to now start deploying up after you've implemented the solutions and then the system becomes very complicated. So thank you. I think I'm ready to take questions now.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Razak, for that wonderful presentation. I think it was actually very, very interesting. There are a lot of things to take into consideration, right? High level, most people just think about it in terms of cost and reliability, but with everything that you've explained, there's so much to factor in terms of the stage of the company as well, whether they're at MVP, growth stage, or scale as well. Okay, I think I'll start with, if you have a question, please raise up your hand and then we'll get to it. So the first question is from the chat. It says, for provider migration, what are the best practices?
Okay, thanks. So for provider migration, so that's moving from one provider to the other, right?
Yeah.
So the best practice is, one, what is very important is that your data is in your own hands, right? So if you're using a particular provider and then you're terminating that relationship, right? The agreement that you've gone into with that provider should include, like, data return. You should be able to return all the data that is in the systems to you because you are the owner of those data, right? You don't want a situation where you terminate a relationship and you don't have access to the historical data. Right? That would be disastrous for the company, right? They should be able to return those data, and then you should be able to transmit that data to the new solution, right? So when you are engaging the new provider, it's a conversation you have to discuss each of these things. You tell them the state of your current provider, the nature, and I know that there are some technicalities around it, which need to involve the tech guys and the engineering guys. Right? the format in which your data is being stored, how it is being stored, the system that you use. It must be compatible with the solution that you want to move to. If it is not compatible, you are going to struggle, right? So, and those are the key areas. And before you move, you ought to know why you are moving. What are the key things that you want to solve? I believe the reason you are moving is because the current solution is not giving you exactly what you want, right? Or it doesn't meet your current goals and aspirations of the company, right? But in moving, you want to ensure that whatever you are migrating is able to move seamlessly. Of course, there will be issues that now need to be resolved. But the easier the data is, you are able to move your data from one system to the other, the better for the company, right? And then you do your due diligence just as if you are onboarding that new solution afresh, regardless of whether you're migrating, right? Do everything, ensure that they have all the solutions, the pricing is right, they solve your problems, and then you can then connect to them and then ensure that the data flows right. I don't know whether there's a follow-up questions to that.
No. Okay. Well, I have a question, right? I know you mentioned that we had to factor in reliability, the experience that customers would be getting, right? But I wanted to ask specifically regarding to, let's say, startups that are being bootstrapped, right? They don't have a lot of cash to burn at the moment. And let's say they have like several KYC providers. So how should they think about cost versus reliability? So if you had to advise a startup in that kind of situation, cash is not a lot, but obviously KYC is a non-negotiable. How should they think about, reliability versus the cost of having a specific provider?
Yeah, of course, reliability is the most important, right? Right. So, and is a trade-off, right? So the way to handle it is in terms of the costs, right? And I think a lot of providers have started doing this, right? Especially the local providers, right? I know some of the global guys are also doing it in such a way that they understand that there are a lot of fintech that are just starting and they don't have the finances at the beginning. So they will have a pricing program that says, okay, in the first, say 6 months, for example, is free, right? You only start paying when you clock a particular, threshold users.
Okay.
Right. So they can tailor the costs according to how you progress as well. There's some of them that do that. I think I've seen like 2 that propose that. So they're just starting, they can part of that journey. Right. But what comes with that is, of course, they want you to sign a longer contract with them, every 3 years. Right. Because probably the first 1 year, they're not going to be paying anything. Right. So there's some solutions that provide those options. And then the next thing you just need to do is to ensure that those solutions, right, they are reliable and they tick the other boxes.
Okay. So it's just about discussing this and finding a solution that fits your company at that specific time, basically. Okay, we have another question in the chat. It's quite long, but let me try to read it. I noticed a lot of KYC providers do a lot of automated responses for retail customers, e.g., you can easily verify the and automatically verify the user's account. I haven't seen so much when it comes to automation innovation for business customers, that's KYB, because there are so many documents to be submitted. How do KYB providers help out here? Do you have any thoughts around this?
Yeah, the person is right. So there are very few solutions out there that solve the KYB requirements question. Right? Even those that I've seen still have some challenges, right? And the reason is because KYB is know your business. So KYB is focusing on corporates, on entities, right? Compared to retail individual customers. It's easier to onboard me and you because that's what most every fintech is doing. But by the time you start onboarding Betty Corporation Limited, it becomes complicated because the company has directors, has shareholders, and the requirements you have to verify those guys. But there are solutions out there, especially the global providers that have solved this in such a way that they also do self-verification for the UBOs of the company. UBOs are the ultimate beneficial owners, meaning the owners of the companies. Right? But they are very few. They're very honest. And I think it's an area that, these providers are going into right now, especially with the advent of B2B. B2B is where almost every fintech is going into. And if you want to onboard businesses digitally, you need to solve that KYB issue.
Okay. I think KYB is actually a bit complex as well because, for example, when a company sends in their documents, I know they look at the shareholders, and if the part of the shareholder is a company, you have to break it down further until you get to actual individuals, and that can actually take a while to complete. So yeah, that's a very complex process. Thank you for your answer. Does anybody else have any other question? Okay. I don't think there's any other question.
Yes, I have a question. Sorry.
Okay.
Hi,
All right.
AbdulRasaq. Thank you so much. So I have two questions actually. Regarding choosing a local or global KYC, at what stage does a company get to that you now decide that it's time for us to scale to a global provider? Like, at what stage do you get to and decide local does not work for us anymore, let's go global? And then my second question would be, for a company who cannot rely on one provider, say we currently use provider A, but maybe due to large number of customers being onboarded, and then they need to combine like another provider, right? What are the things that one need to look out for when it comes to having two providers? Because you're not just using one now, you're going to be using two. I don't know if people use like three providers at once, but I've seen two, right? What are the things that needs to be considered when combining two providers at the same time?
Thanks. So good questions. So the stage that we need to get through start thinking of changing provider, moving to the global guys. Part of the important processes that you need to put in place, right? Especially the compliance department, is you need to be able to measure the effectiveness of whatever solution you vis-a-vis the expected outcome, right? With the company's context in play, right? So if onboarded a local guy, the guy is helping you, you are seeing good results, good conversion rates, right? But if that guy doesn't have a feature that does customer risk assessment, for example, right? And the requirement says you have to do customer risk assessment, and the guy doesn't have it, you probably do not have any option than to look for someone that has it, right? Especially if you look at the new requirements now that CBN is pushing for automation of almost the entire CFT process, right? So there are different deciders that it could be business, it could be regulatory, business in terms of if after onboarding the solution, right, the conversion rate is not impressive, it's very bad, right? Yes, of course, perhaps the diligence you did before bringing in that provider, right, was erroneous. Maybe it was not properly done. But you need to take a decision at a point to say, hey guys, we cannot continue, having failed onboarding. We need to build in some more guys. Or if your company is saying that, okay, now we want to expand, we want to start doing remittance, for example, we need to expand to the UK, we need to expand to the US. If the provider does not have the necessary features to be able to onboard, residents in the UK, right, then you might need to now start thinking of. So there's no one single answer to say this is when you move. Different factors will contribute to when you decide to move, depending on scenario or the use case of a particular company. Now, to the second question, yes, of course, I've seen companies that use multiple providers, right? Because some providers, like you have a provider, for example, that is only giving you identity verification in Nigeria. Because you have operations in Ghana, the guy is not in Ghana, you need to have another provider in Ghana, right? But at the end of the day, right, the outcome of each of these checks that these providers are doing should be going to somewhere that is owned by you, the back end, right? That you can control, right? So each of these providers should be able to communicate to your own internal tools and solutions and dashboards in such a way that it is smooth, regardless of the number of providers that you have. You want to have that smooth transmission of data, right? In such a way that you will not have problems saying, oh, this provider does not is sending first name to date of birth instead of this, right? You don't want to have these kind of issues, right? You need to be sure that each of these providers are able to transmit the results. And then it doesn't affect the user experience, right? The user does not care to know whether you are using provider A or provider B. All they want to do is onboard and transact, right? So it is you that you are supposed to put in the processes in place, right, to ensure that everything is good. And this is one of the disadvantages of having a full suite solution or provider. There are some providers, especially the global provider, they give you everything from onboarding to transaction monitoring to the dashboard to the case management and all of those things, right? Once you go for those solutions that give you a full suite, then it becomes difficult for you to bring in an additional provider, right? If you don't have your own back end where you put all of these things together. So there are a lot of things that goes into some of these things, depending on the direction in which the company wants to go, the goal that you want to have. But it is very good that, in fact, some companies now, some fintechs now are beginning to build their own KYC solutions. They've used local providers, they've used global providers, but they decide, hey guys, what is happening? We need to build our own solution. Right. And of course, they connect with the various databases that themselves as well. And for some, it's working fine. Right. So there is no one single answer for some of these questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Abosede, does that cover it? Does that cover your question?
Yes, it does. But I also have one more. Thank you for your response. So, for someone, I work in product, right? And I work a lot with the compliance team. And my question is around, say, compliance says, oh, there's this KYC provider that we want you to integrate with, right? And then for us in product, we've analyzed how it works, considered how it's going to flow with the user journey. And then it doesn't sit with, the product team because it's going to cause friction in user journey, right? But then compliance says, oh, we want this KYC provider. We want you to still use this provider for someone, I know you've worked in compliance, you work in compliance. Like, how does one navigate this scenario, especially for you in compliance? And then compliance is the one bringing this to say, oh, use this provider. But then someone in product is saying, no, this particular provider is going to cause friction in our user journey. How do we navigate this particular scenario?
Yeah, I mean, there's always that friction between compliance and product and business and all. But I think the way I try to solve some of those concerns is focusing on the problem. What is the problem, right? And at what stage is the compliance team involving the product guys and the engineering guys in the conversation, right? It is not ideal that the compliance team alone does the vendor assessment and then choose a provider and then impose that provider on everybody else. It's not ideal because at the end of the day, if that solution does not integrate well with the company's assets solutions, if that solution that you are implementing goes to reduce the numbers, because onboarding is user experience, in fact, some KYC processes, right, interject payment onboarding. Yeah, they can stop onboarding process to say there's a fraud, or payment process to say there's a fraud. So you need to carry everybody along to say, hey guys, we need to do this. Perhaps there's a new regulation. We need to do this. How do we do this? Here are the providers. Like, I will typically bring my technology team, the head of technology, right, to meetings with providers so that he can look at how their system is, what we need to do, how it will affect our system, and then we can decide to say, okay, do we need to fix something in our system? Because if this is a new regulatory requirement, right, and your system is not aligning with it, right, you need to find a way to marry between. Because the regulatory requirement is regulatory requirement, right? If you don't do it, you'll probably be sanctioned for it, right? And if all the solutions, all the options you have, they are saying it's the same flow, but it's only your own internal system that is disagreeing with that, then perhaps maybe you need to really change one of the things in the system. Which is the things you need to change internally. You can a bit delay the implementation, right? Because my principle is there's usually no hurry in implementing solutions. Because if you hurry to implement solutions, yeah, you face more problems, and then you pay the provider, and then you pay resources to fix the issues. So I think better collaborations, if other stakeholders like the product, the engineering team are brought into the conversations earlier, I think it will be easier not just to adopt the solutions that that is best for the company. It is easier for them, for the product guys, to even understand that, oh, this is the way things are moving now. Perhaps our systems design to also change. Right? So that's the way I try to solve it. But of course, there will always be frictions between both departments.
All right, thank you. Thank you. We have one more question in the chat, and then that'll be all. So the question goes, you mentioned compliance doesn't just end at regulatory compliance. For a company still at MVP level, which other compliance practices are critical to focus on?
So MVP level, I want to believe is after you have your license, right? Because before you before you roll out the product, right? If you have the right license for that service, then hey, that's my own MVP level. You have a license, and because you have a license, you are subject to the regulatory requirements. Right? They are basically regulatory requirements, right? That is, you cannot do it. Right. For example, if you are onboarding individuals, you have to do billing qualification, for example, in Nigeria today, right? So they are there, right? There are some other things that you can do manually, right? At least even the new minimum standard or baseline standard is going to take effect not immediately, right? There's still time. There are some compliance processes that you can still do manual. For example, this customer risk assessment, right? You can still do that manually right now. And then you can explain to the regulators how effective the manual process is. In fact, a lot of companies are still doing it manually today, even the big guys in the industry. Right. So there are some that you cannot do, and that is why in my presentation, if you are just starting for MVP, it is best to go with a local provider. That will give you the basic, those local providers already have those basic standards that, will not throw you to troubles. And then you can, other things you can read manually. Like you can, and then going forward, you can automate, you can even automate it. Thank God there is AI now, right? There is Claude AI that will probably do everything for you right now, like very cheap, right? So before you go to the global guys, right, find ways to augment what. But of course, in terms of identity verification, the PA verification, the identity verification, you cannot do that all by yourself. Right? You need to connect to the database. But for some other things, there are ways you can do it without having to pay the internet.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that response. I think that's the last question. Thank you everyone for the lovely questions. And can everyone just, take a moment to appreciate Razak for the wonderful session, right? This was very, very insightful. I know that personally I have learned a lot of things. Abosede would also be dropping a link to a Twitter post. You can also share your thoughts there, just so that, everybody also knows how you feel about the session. We'd basically like to get your feedback. So thank you, everyone. So you see the link in the chats right now, and you can just drop your feedback. Let us know how you felt about the session. And Razak will also be reading the comments as well. So please say nice things. All right. All right.
Thank you, guys. Have a nice day.
All right. Thank you. So moving forward, I'm going to try my best to wrap up the session because we've already spent a lot of time. So if you're not already a part of the BIF community, you can join the community, right? We have a Slack channel where we have different people from different sectors of fintech, right? So we discuss different things. We have a lot of sessions. We're talking about basically everything that is happening in fintech. And it's also a way for you to stay updated, right? Like, even if you are not seeing it, as long as you are in the community, you are definitely seeing what's going on. So you can join the community. The link will be shared in the chat right now, so you can get access to join us. So just send a request. You can also subscribe to our newsletter. So newsflash, we sent out we've rebranded our newsletter basically, right? Our newsletter now has a voice and it's now much packed with a lot of things. So if you're looking for a place where you can get a breakdown of everything that's happening in fintech in Nigeria, fintech in Africa, we are writing everything and putting it together for you. We are breaking it down so you don't have to look, different places to get your news. We're bringing it right to your doorstep. So go ahead and subscribe to our Substack, right? We have a lot more exciting things coming out, but yeah, we started yesterday. We sent out the first batch of our rebranded newsletter. So we are putting in more information and making it more valuable to you. So the link, you will also find it in the chat. Yeah, so there's so many things that you can get from the newsletter. So let me go on to the next thing. We also have a YouTube channel. So the YouTube is basically like a repository to find our previous sessions. So if you have not been joining our previous sessions before now, you can go to YouTube, find us at Builders in Fintech, and you see all our previous sessions. We're also going to upload this session, right? So if you missed a part of it or you just want to do a recap just to understand, more things, you can go check us out on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe as well. Don't just watch our videos, subscribe as well. All right. Okay. So for this is a new initiative that we have. It's called Fintech Reader. So what we are doing basically is spotlighting new startups in Africa. So if you're working on something, you have a startup that you would want us to spotlight, basically put some spotlight on what you are building, let people within the fintech ecosystem see it, let customers also see it, right? If it's something that you want to put out there, you only need to have something that people can interact with, right? We're also going to be dropping the link in the chat section. So if you're working on something, right, you can text me if you have any questions, or you can also visit Builders in Fintech /reader to submit your startup, right? It's a community of builders, right? So we want to make sure that we are assisting you however we can. And right now, what we can do is to put whatever you're building in the spotlight, right? Even if you're building, you don't have to do it by yourself. That's why we're here. We're here to help. So whatever you're building, you can let us know and we'll push it out there for you. So just reach out to us on this. Okay. Yeah, so you can follow us on our social media pages. We are on Instagram, we are on LinkedIn, we are on X. Follow us everywhere so that you don't miss another update. Yeah. So BIF is basically here to support you in your journey as a builder in the fintech ecosystem. If you're building something, if you want to meet more people, if you want to collaborate, you want to brainstorm, or you want to put your startup out there, right? So more people can get to know you, or you also just want to read up, right? Resources. You want more resources on things that are happening in fintech, how the people that have already built, how they are doing it, basically breakdowns. You can also check out African Fintech Library, where we have a lot of resources there. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. All the links are in the chat section, so you can check it out. Follow us everywhere, and stay with us, right? Because we have so much more coming, and this is just one of many initiatives that we have for you. All right, then. Thank you so much for joining the call, and we have come to the end of today's session. Also, sorry to the people that could not join the game. I don't know why that happened, but we'll make sure that next time it's working really properly. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a lovely weekend. Bye.